Hello, everybody. This is 19 to the Dozen, the podcast where we meet Prague foreigners and find out about their amazing stories. Today with us is Dr. Daniel Glaser, neuroscientist, podcaster, actually filming on location, and this is how we met, right?
That's correct.
Thank you for being here. I mean, it's such just by spending a few hours on the internet, looking you up, right? Because we met in the bookstore, and by the way, we are in the Globe bookstore again. Thank you very much, Globe, for being such a nice host. This is the place where you can buy English books in Prague, or just order them. They will bring it for you, and so on. So, without
I have to
further
say, Bogdan, it's
ado,
the only bookshop I've been in Prague, but it's also the best bookshop I've been in Prague.
there you go. Thank you again, Globe Bookstore, for hosting us for the second time, and thank you again, Daniel, for just sitting down with us.
You're very welcome.
So, however you want to start, we were just here filming the first episode. Daniel just came into the shop for Whitebird.
I came in for a book called White Bird, that's right. I can tell you why if you're interested. Well, so White Bird is a graphic novel, bande dessinée as we say, and it's by a writer called R.J. Palacio. She's a New York publicist and author, and many people will know a book she wrote called Wonder, Wonder, which was subsequently made into a film with Julia Roberts and Owen Wilson, and it's the story of a boy with facial disfigurement, and it's set in contemporary New York, and she wrote a successor story to it called White Bird. It was a chapter within the original novel, which was actually in the second edition of that book, and she then expanded it into a story. And White Bird is the story of the childhood of the grandmother of one of the characters from the Wonder story.
Okay.
And the character is a bully, and his grandmother tells him a story about her own life, which helps him to understand his own behavior. And the story of White Bird is the story of a young Jewish girl who is hidden by her non-Jewish neighbours during the war in France, and the extraordinary sacrifices that her neighbours make to keep her safe. And my daughter plays the heroine, who's called Sarah.
Okay. Cool. Wow. Okay. So you're basically filming in Prague. Is the story connected to Prague, or is Prague going to be Paris?
Prague, in this case, is going to be Paris. I think Prague is many things to many people, and I guess that's kind of one of the themes for the podcast, right? Which is what intrigued me when you told me what you were doing. But in this case, as is the case frequently, I believe, Prague is going to be for Paris.
For sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's been Berlin, and it's been some other places as well.
Yeah.
Stan, anything comes to mind?
Exactly.
No. Okay. So, what does a neuroscientist, a doctor neuroscientist, have to do with filming? Are you here just for your daughter, or are you here to counsel or to?
Yeah, it's been a very interesting process. I have been practicing invisibility. I don't know if you've ever tried to be invisible.
No, I have not.
So there's a few things you need to do to be invisible. One is I'm finding you have to unclench your buttocks, is kind of a thing, right? If you just relax so that you're not kind of leaning forward and pushing for stuff, that helps. Clearly, it also helps not to meet people's eyes, so you don't catch people's eyes. And also, it's really weird, but you put your head down, and you actually even sometimes face the wall. And with all of these tricks, you make yourself invisible. Why was I trying to be invisible? Because my role here is as the chaperone. So my daughter was 15 when we got here. She's 16 now.
Okay.
And the British laws are very strict in terms of the protection of young people on film sets, and so there's a chaperone has to be with her the whole time, and that was me. But aside from making sure that she's safe, not only was I not supposed to do anything, I was supposed to do nothing, right? I mean, my job was not to be there. And we'll talk about my daughter if you like in a minute, but certainly from the production's point of view, yeah, I was supposed to be absent. So no, I was not here as a neuroscientist. I was not contributing any neuroscience. I was keeping my head down, trying not to get in the way, which is kind of interesting, an interesting role for somebody who likes to talk as much as I do.
Yeah, let's talk about. I mean, if you want to share something that your daughter has done before that maybe the viewers can go to and watch or stuff like that. I mean, yeah.
Sure. So she was in one film before. So she always wanted to be an actor, but I think a lot of people want to be actors. I mean, I never really did, but a lot of people do. She was found at school for a film called Radioactive that starred Rosamund Pike, who is also in Prague right now. I think everyone's in Prague right now. But
Gillian Anderson is in Prague.
Gillian
Right?
Anderson was in Prague for this film. Rosamund's in Prague for a different thing. The film she was in before was the life story of Marie Curie, the scientist. Marie Curie, the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, the first person to win 2 Nobel Prizes, and still the only person to have won 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different disciplines. Right. So then her daughter, who was played by Ariella, by my daughter, Irène Curie-Joliot, also won the Nobel Prize in her own right. And that's it is the only, I believe, mother-daughter and father-daughter pairing for Nobel Prizes.
Yeah.
So my daughter played that and then was selected for this role. And I mean, listen, she's doing an amazing job. In Yiddish, there's a phrase called nachas. And nachas is the pride that a parent gets in the performance of their children. And you can think about it as kind of going, oh, wow, they did a really good job. But actually, I think it means something even more than that. It means, I have no idea how they did that, right? I just don't know how they did that. And that's kind of the feeling that I've had.
Is it what people call talent?
I think she must be talented. Yeah. I mean, she asked me when we got here, she said, Daddy, did you know that I could act? And I was like, no. And she was like, well, why did you let me do the film then? And I said, well, it's a Hollywood studio picture. They're investing tens of millions of dollars. I kind of trusted that if they didn't think you could act, then they wouldn't let you do it. And so, yeah.
Nice. Yeah. So, where are you originally British, right? But what part of Britain or?
So I am from London. Grew up in Camden Town in London, which is kind of a fashionable, touristy, slightly grungy bit. Lots of live music.
Watch from there.
You got your watch from Camden. Is it still working?
Yeah.
Okay, well, you did a good job. So Camden's cool. My wife grew up in Hampstead. We live, near to where my mum lives, near to where her parents used to live. So very kind of local existence. Our kids go to the same school that she went to when she was a girl. So really a very local existence there. Family is Jewish. Her mother was Moroccan. My parents were kind of German and Polish. But grew up in UK. So yeah, it's kind of stable North London existence.
So, do you follow football?
No,
you don't. Okay, because I
really
think Tottenham would be there, or
yes. So I think so. My nephew rather follows Arsenal, and so I guess I would have to follow Arsenal, but I am deeply uninterested in sport, I'm afraid. I hope that doesn't... You can stop recording now, Stan, if you need to. It's like, if you can forgive me, I think that'll be okay.
And so therefore, why I wanted to know where initially you're from, just to understand and to open the follow-on question, which is what how do you see Prague? What Well, have you ever traveled as a tourist before this movie opportunity? And
yeah,
I think you've seen it throughout the decades in a way. I mean, if
it's true, it's a good thing. So I've been to Prague once before, and that was an interesting story. I did my PhD in Israel, and in the early 90s, shortly after the reunification of Germany, the German government became very concerned about the imbalance between the former East and the former West in lots of different ways. And I think if you draw maps of demographics and of politics and of living standards and education and so on, you can still see the border that was, just from the state. So they brought a bunch of Israeli neuroscientists to Dresden, and we had a 5-day workshop with some neuroscientists from the former East, from Eastern Germany, with a specific intention on part of the German government to increase the standard of neuroscience in the former East. And we had a rest day from this, and we took a train from Dresden. We visited Theresienstadt, and then we came to Prague overnight. And this would have been about 1992. And yeah, I mean, it was so relatively soon after the opening up, and I formed a strong impression of it. Now we are sitting in a bookshop, and I have to say, Bogdan, Globe Bookshop, one of the best, the best English library in Prague. It's such a pleasure looking over your shoulder as we speak, and half the books I see I want to read, and half of them I've already read, and obviously, inevitably, my image of Prague, is from The Unbearable Lightness of Being in part.
Okay.
And the
Kundera.
city, Milan Kundera's book, which I read, as a youth, as a teenager, and have reread at least once since, and of course seen the film with Daniel Day-Lewis, but like the book more. And I quote from it, quite often, in fact, bits that I love. And so I think, for me, it's a city which is associated with the memories of that book. And like my mother always used to say, that you shouldn't see a film that's from a book until you've read the book.
Okay.
Right? Because you can't, once you've seen the film, the characters, you can't help but see the characters in the book, in with the face of the actors. Maybe there's an argument that you shouldn't read a book about a city until you've been to the city, because once you've read The Unbearable Lightness of Being, it's very difficult not to feel it in the city as you walk around. And I don't know whether Prague residents, Prague natives, are horribly sick and bored of everybody seeing their city through the lens of some sex-mad doctor, but there it is.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's I've read it, but as well in university I never came back to it. And for me, in a way, I think the first images of Prague in my mind were maybe in Kafka's Trial.
Mm-hmm.
Like the climb to the castle and those kind of things, maybe.
Yes. It's funny that one of the characters in the film, the father of my daughter, the screen father of my daughter, is a also Israeli actor called Shai Ganon, and he, if you look him up, has a series on National Geographic Channel of street food, and for some reason which I don't quite understand, he's Canadian and Israeli. For this series, he adopts the persona of this kind of English geezer, like from Camden. Stan, I'm going to have to turn away from the microphone when I do this. Don't do anything because it's going to be a bit loud. But we watched the episode where he's in Prague, and he goes, "Oh, I'm in Prague." That's what he's like, "Oh, I'm in Prague." And they do some shtick at the beginning of it. The one that they filmed for him was him being rushed backwards up a staircase and thrown out of a window. So he says that the thing, in his view, which Prague is most known for, is people being, we say in English, defenestrated, thrown out of windows. Which, that wasn't something that was in my mind, but I guess everybody has their own prejudices, right?
Yeah, cool. Doing a little bit of stalking, as I mentioned, I came upon your TEDx speech in Birmingham, I think it was.
I had a terrible eye infection when I was doing it. I was like, "Oh, I'm so glad you watched that, but I do hope you forgive the weeping sore on the side of my eye for that."
Well, to me, it was really interesting that this is, if we are going to touch a little bit of neuroscience and your field as well, it's a great opener for, I think, for how does social media influence the way we think? Or shall we start with what does neuroscience study first, or how do you
I don't know. Which one do we put to bed first? I mean, it's probably easier to answer the question, what does neuroscience study?
Yes, let's
and the answer is, by the way, it's interesting to note that neuroscience as a field of study, like a professor of neuroscience, is really recent. So only since the 1990s has neuroscience been a thing.
Okay.
So
who was studying
right,
neuro?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So neuroscience is a subfield within the field of biology.
Okay.
Okay. So it's neuroscience is a scientific inquiry into the biological systems of nerves, neuro and nerves, right? So nerves is a category of cell in humans and all animals, I guess. And, we have skin cells, we have muscle cells, whatever. Nerve cells are essentially signaling devices. So generally nerve cells are elongated, they're a bit like wires, and mostly they use electrical signaling to send impulses along them. So that's how you do sensation and movement in your periphery. As you can tell, Bogdan, for a podcast, I use hand gestures a lot, but Stan will confirm that I'm moving my hands around, and that's done with nerves. And then, so you can do what we call peripheral neuroscience, which is the study of nerves and pain sensors and all this kind of stuff. My interest is in what we would call the central nervous system, and particularly the brain. The brain is the organ of the mind. It's where thinking is done. And neuroscience looks at the brain as a biological system. And there are plenty of other ways of looking at the brain. You can look at it as a psychological, or as a social, or as a philosophical, or as a spiritual, or as a religious thing. But neuroscience takes a biological perspective on the operation of, in my case, the mind.
Strictly, to me, this means that it's strictly structural, and whatever process is there, we can study, we do, but it just ends kind of to that. We don't ask the moral question, we don't ask the ethical question, we just look it from, like, as you said, like biology does to the rest of the body, right?
Yes, so I don't think it's right to say that it's structural in the sense that we can look at function as well. So we do spend a lot of time looking at the structures of the brain, and we can learn a lot from the anatomy. But if we think about how the cells fire, if we think about the patterns of their firing, we can analyze that mathematically. That's fine. We can do that within biology. We can look at the rhythms of the firing of things. We can look at the correlations and the connections between different kind of firing patterns and all of that. So no, it's not just structure. It is function. It is the firing and so on. But you are right that ethical questions, questions of morals, and potentially also subjective questions, so questions of what things feel like, are not properly, or at least not solely, biological questions. So to answer questions like that, you almost certainly have to involve other areas like philosophy and so on. Now, there are some pretty hard-line biologists who believe that you can explain everything, including morals and everything, just with reference to the firing pattern of neurons. But most neuroscientists would say that there are limits to what neuroscience on its own can explore, and that it needs to collaborate with other disciplines if we're getting into meaty stuff, as we say, like morals and ethics.
Cool. Coming back to this functional and structural thing, if one of the things which I don't follow the science.
Listen, one of the things you need to know about science these days is that nobody follows it, right? I mean, because
okay.
like everybody who's a scientist is doing something, but there are so many other hundreds of thousands of scientists doing other things that, roughly speaking, as soon as you move, 2 labs away,
Okay,
you don't know what's
but
going
I mean,
on.
I could, have a look on the Nature magazine or stuff like that, okay. So, one of the things that is coming out from this field lately is Elon Musk's Neuralink, I think it's called, and the way that works, as far as I understand, is just like injecting, putting in some really thin electrodes, like wires, as you mentioned, into the brain, connect them with a certain part of the neural cortex which is responsible for some sensation or some movement or whatever, and stimulating that in a way in which that part becomes functional. He's pitching as, I guess, cancer cure for vascular cerebral accidents and so on. So people that might still be alive, but some of their part of their cortex is not functioning correctly and so on. So is this real science or is it fringe? I mean, are we there yet? And if we are, this opens like are we going to be, is anthropology going to change the definition of a human being and so on? I mean, there's millions of questions there.
There sure are. I want to tell you a joke, Bogdan. I was at a wedding in France of a friend of mine, and one of her friends was there as well, and this friend is a woman, is blonde, and is a lesbian, and is also works for the European Space Agency, and so we had a competition at this wedding to see. The kind of, well, it's not brain science, well, it's not rocket science. So she was the rocket scientist and I was the brain scientist. And so we tried to work out who was more effective at picking up girls at the wedding, the neuroscientist or the rocket scientist or the brain scientist. And I think we resolved that the rocket scientist was doing better in this case than the brain scientist, but it was a very small sample. So Elon Musk kind of... I think is neither a rocket scientist nor a brain scientist, right? Although he does both. So I don't think he's a scientist. I think he's a businessman. I think he's an entrepreneur.
Okay.
And I think he's a marketeer. The product which he tries to market most effectively is Elon Musk, and he constructs stories which boost that. Now, as a matter of fact, there are these rockets that he's had built, which, as a matter of fact, do
Fly.
take off.
Yeah.
And right now they are, my understanding is, amongst the most effective rockets for launching satellites that are there. So you can't argue with that. The Neuralink stuff. Okay, so first of all, what is it he's done? You're basically right. He's taken some electrodes and he's implanted them into the brain of a monkey. With electrodes in the brain, you can do two things. You can do input and you can do output. So one of the things he can do with these electrodes is to record from potentially single units, single nerve cells. Remember, you know, in the brain of humans, you've got 100 billion nerve cells, so a lot. So you can record from single ones, or you can record from small ensembles, small groups of neurons. And with an electrode in place, you can get a much finer resolution in recording from the neurons than you can from outside the head. Maybe we'll come to that later, but he can record. And as you say, he can also stimulate. Now, what can you learn from this? Well, it's an interesting question. So first of all, you know, data is data. So yeah, that's cool. Now, secondly, yeah, so if you are recording from neurons whose principal responsibility in life is to control movement,
Okay.
then if you record from a nerve cell that's trying to lift the arm, right, and you connect it to a robot arm, then the nerve cells will move the robot arm.
This is how prosthetics work?
Right, so one of the motivations for that, but again, you know, I think the motivation for Elon Musk, and I don't have a problem with this in itself, is he just wants to do stuff, right? I mean, he wants to try stuff. So as neuroscientists as well, often when we're trying to do really cool experiments, we motivate it in terms of people who have problems, right? So we say, ooh, this would be great if you've had a spinal injury, is the classic one. So if you've got a spinal injury, which means that your brain can no longer communicate with your body because there's been a physical interruption. Stan, I'm doing it again with my hands. Stan, I'm moving my... oh, you got a camera. All right. Hey guys. Moving, for those of you without pictures, I'm making a cutting motion on my neck. So if the nerve cells cut... then the impulses can't travel from your brain to your body, so you're paralyzed, right?
Yeah.
If you can record from the bit of the brain whose job it is to move the arm, then you can move the arm. Okay, cool. You can also play video games, right? So you can have a virtual arm in a video game that can be stimulated by that. You probably aren't going to be able to... It's not going to work. If you've got damage to the brain from a stroke, then sticking an electrode in the bit of the brain that isn't working anymore isn't going to work because it's not working, right?
Okay.
So that's okay.
Okay.
But yeah, so it can get around that. Now, the only thing I would say about the Musk stuff, people have been doing that. There's a guy called Nikolalis, if you want to look it up, who's working in Germany, who's been doing stuff like that for a decade or more. So the implanting wires into monkey brains, certainly, and even for humans, they've done it a fair amount, is not particularly new. What's new in life? I don't know. Maybe they can... So you can get better low-powered amplifiers, so you can have smaller batteries if you're going to implant it and carry it around. Maybe you can seal up the head afterwards. You've got more powerful computers, so you can analyze more of the cells quicker and generate from them. But the technology in itself is not novel. Can you do anything completely different with that than you could with anything else? No, not really. I mean, you know, the best way of working out what's going on inside someone's head is to ask a really good friend of theirs, right? I mean, and then, you know, it's also quite good to watch where their eyes are moving and to look at the movement of their bodies. We can come back to that. You can record from nerve cells in their brains, but honestly, there are so many cells and we know so little in most cases about what they do that the idea that you can read out a brain with an electrode is still some way from being true, and is probably never, you know, because there are so many bloody nerve cells, neurons, is going to be a long while before we can make any significant progress of understanding something.
Our lifetime? Our kids' lifetime?
No, I still think the
You
best
really
way to
think
read
it's
out a
so
brain
far
is a
away?
body. Yeah, I mean, so on the specific thing of controlling a hand movement, right, we do know pretty well what the anatomy of the control of the body is, and we can pretty much, can't quite get to the muscle level. Well, I mean, for single cells we can. So yeah, maybe with that you can. But for anything interesting, it's going to be hundreds of millions of nerve cells involved in any process, and decoding them is still, I think, a very long way off.
Okay. Yeah, because you mentioned data. In IT, there is this kind of funny way of saying that if you torture the data, it will in the end confess to anything. So, you know, it's a problem of how we look at the data as well. But at the same time, there is always also this problem of insatiable human curiosity, I think, in general, I guess, which sometimes the result of that is, for example, if we talk about social media today, like we're now it seems that we're discussing privacy, but the subject was on the table like maybe 10, 15 years ago when all the big 5, 6 internet companies were starting. And therefore, if we make a analogy with this with the development of this kind of technology for brain study and brain reading and all this kind of brain mapping and so on, I'm afraid as a consumer strictly that my privacy will not be on the table for this discussion in any way. I mean, what's your take on what's neuroscience take on this? The Basically how I would say it is like technology is evolving so fast that sometimes we're left behind somehow.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good. Okay, there's a bunch of questions in there. I'll come back to what neuroscience has to say about it in a minute. But let me tell you what I think. We're in an age of COVID. That's why we're tested regularly. We're sitting at a distance here. We have good ventilation in the space that we're speaking. I can tell there's good ventilation because I can smell the cigarette from outside. Right, so that means the airflow is working. Well done, guys. So it does seem to me, in fact, that when we look back on this COVID period, in many ways, the most significant change will be about privacy, and I'll tell you why. Very soon after the first lockdown in UK was a Jewish festival called Passover or Pesach. And in this festival, people gather with their families and retell the story of the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, in the famous song "Let My People Go." And it's traditional for families to meet and to celebrate this. Now, obviously, in our family, it's at least 12 people. Normally can be up to 15, 20. In this case, we were down to just the 5 of us. And we used Zoom to connect. And actually, there were 50 different families from our synagogue that were all on this Zoom Seder, which was incredibly moving and lovely. I don't think there had ever been a Seder on Zoom before.
Okay.
And over the last year, I say from dating to deathbed, right? Every form of human interaction, suddenly people started to do online. So within the world of work, all kinds of meetings, job interviews, people being fired, annual reviews, domestically people arguing about recipes and shopping, the whole world of exercise classes, obviously sex, but lots of relationship stuff, family breakdowns, people dying. A lot of people died on Zoom over the last year in the world. None of that was ever recorded before. And you may remember, but, around about the summer, all of the different companies started offering live subtitles where they would do the real-time transcription, in fact, real-time translation as well, which the translation bit, if it's all hilarious, in fact, I mean, when the things that it says in real time. Now, but this just tells you something you could have known, but it's proved now that they are doing speech recognition in real time on all of these things. So actually, if you think about human interaction, the range of human interactions which the big companies now have on file about us is hugely increased after this year compared to the previous year. And I'd be like, whatever, you can either be excited by that or scared by it or both. I think I'm both. But you want privacy? It feels to me that the biggest step change in terms of invasion of privacy has come through COVID.
Cool, yeah. And it's funny to mention that because actually COVID, at least the experience was like right 1 year ago, March, let's say 2020. February 2020, if I'm not mistaken, Amnesty International. For me, I'm Romanian, so I was alive when the '89. I kind of remember part of it. For us, Amnesty International was the NGO that would come and check if the elections are fair and this kind of things. So like 1 month before the pandemic, I've seen it on LinkedIn. They put out a report saying that the big 5 on the internet are actually hurting freedom of speech by their privacy laws and so on. And of course, the Google, Facebook were mentioned there with real examples, with class suits that are going on and we don't know about and so on. So it's really funny to say that immediately after a month from Amnesty International releasing like a huge white paper, saying that actually the social media platforms are kind of against, they're like one obstacle against freedom of speech, then COVID comes and actually does the total opposite. Everybody moves online and they harvest more data from us. It's kind of
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, look, I've worked for Google a lot last year. So, and you have as well worked for... No.
I've seen it, and
Yeah.
I would have
Yeah.
wanted to ask what
Sure.
were you doing.
No. So I mean, I think I believe in engagement. That's what I do, and so I was working with them on projects in London and other European cities, looking at what it's like to have Google as a neighbor. So what's the physical interface to Google look like? They're building new buildings. What can they do for local communities? How can they enhance? And you can look at things different ways. But I mean, my own personal view is that Google kind of is supporting local high streets, is supporting local interactions because they can make money from it, right? I mean, they're not a charity, but if there are more people shopping locally as opposed to Amazon, which kind of wants to destroy local shops. So for me, as somebody who's really interested in 15-minute cities and local communities and interactions and face-to-face, there's more interest for Google in people doing more things locally than there is, let's say, for Amazon or Facebook. But
I agree with that. Yeah,
interested in a beauty pageant in that way. But no, I think it is very problematic, the lack of scrutiny and the lack of regulation for internet companies. To boycott them is kind of impossible. And my own view is that I can influence by being... I mean, this unpleasant English phrase, it's better to be inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. I've felt comfortable working at Google because the people I was working with were committed to supporting local interaction, supporting young people's futures, and did very material things to advance that. But I think it's quite reasonable to be scared about it, and I think that one should proceed democratically and in an organised way, right? I mean, I think that there's been some really interesting stuff online, actually, in the last few days about Facebook. And so it was an analysis from a former Facebook employee looking at how long it took for Facebook to take down botnets that were, so networks of online robots that were built to artificially inflate particular views, right? So it's quite easy online. You pay some money, you get however many, 10,000, 100,000, million false users. You can then program them automatically to like a post that you think is important. Everybody does it. I mean, I don't do it, Bogdan. Maybe you don't. Perhaps the podcast needs it, but who knows? Particularly governments do it. And the analysis was, how rapidly does Facebook take down government-driven botnets? And the answer is it does it much more rapidly in a US, Western Europe, or Russian context than in countries in Asia, in the Stans, in South America. So it's not that they're more common in Europe or in America, it's just that there is more free press and more scrutiny of Facebook in those territories. So they, by that analysis, if you believe it, will do exactly as much as they can get away with in terms of that stuff. So I'm not cynical about it. Again, I imagine somewhere in this very bookshop is a book by Shoshana Zuboff called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And I mean, it's a great book. I didn't finish it, but most of it you can get from the beginning. And once you've read that, it's very difficult not to be cynical about these companies and what they're doing.
Okay, so what is the solution then? Just regulation? Does UK, due to Brexit, do you guys have now, let's say, an opportunity to regulate differently than US and European Union?
Oh, we sure do, but that would be kind of silly, and I don't know that we necessarily want to get into Brexit specifically. But leaving GDPR, so GDPR is the global, what does it stand for, Bogdan? But something data and privacy and regulation.
General data privacy
regulation.
regulation.
So GDPR is one of the most effective pieces of legislation and weapon in the war against the companies, if you want to frame it that way. Britain leaving that is a, as with many of the ideas, in my view, not sensible for Britain's future. GDPR was cool because for a while the companies were saying, hey, we could do a version of the Facebook homepage that's GDPR compliant for everyone in Europe, and then we could do one in America where we could do what we want, and in China where we could do just whatever the Chinese government wants to do. Luckily, I guess, it's quite inefficient to do that, and GDPR also covers anyone who handles European data, even if they're not in Europe.
Yeah.
So I think we will find GDPR to be one of the most significant decisions. And in terms of how I think about Europe, right, as an entity, GDPR is the most significant
Okay, cool.
action. So I think we need to do more of that. I don't know that individual consumer action is important. I think political action is important, and coordinated political action is important. Because if countries work together to an agreed standard which they enforce, then it becomes commercially inefficient for the corporations not to follow it.
I mentioned Brexit because to me, like the 4 years of Trump and Brexit was kind of the same kind of thing. It's the same recipe. I'm sure it will be proved in a couple of years. It was all, with the Russian kind of Facebook manipulation or whatever. That kind of thing. It's this. Isn't it the same face of? Isn't it two different faces of the same kind of thing? Don't the bad guys are like happy now?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Well, how do you make a bad guy happy?
And you mentioned also freedom of press. Look at the U.S. in the last 4 years. They were talking about a different narrative in school. There was the narrative. I mean, what do you need? What do you mean a different narrative? And they pushed it so much, and it became a meme for smart people. But it kind of got the point of becoming a norm, like flat Earth, like all the other craziness floating around there. I mean,
I hear that you're quite exercised by this book. Yeah. So look, I think that my perspective is, if anything, a little more pessimistic than yours. I think so. Look, I think there are as you in your phrase, all kinds of craziness about. Okay. I think some kinds of craziness are more dangerous than other kinds, and my own feeling is that you can't simply explain the decisions that I disagree with in, let's say, UK and US on Russian manipulation. I'm rather afraid that my own fellow citizens and my dear friends, the Americans... It is a superficial view, I agree. No, it's not superficial, but I think it lets the English and the Americans off the hook. I think British people need to take responsibility for what they did, and I'm not prepared to simply blame the Russians for the mistakes that were made, nor am I prepared to blame the Russians.
But it was so close, Daniel. I mean, it was so close that maybe one Facebook... What if you can trace everything to one Facebook post? You know what I mean? Well, it was so close. It was like, 51-48, something like that.
So
in real life, it was like, 50,000 people?
Yes, but the factual question of who won or didn't win the election, to me, is less frightening. So there were consequences of the wrong result, okay? But the fact that it was close, even, is what was scary, right? It could have been that the Russian bots pushed it over the edge. But the fact, even if it was 45%...
It was still too much for the... Yeah.
The idea, and you're familiar with this idea of the Overton window. So the Overton window is this idea that there are certain things which are unacceptable, for example, ways of talking about immigrants or foreigners. And over the last 10 years in the UK discourse, ways that you're allowed to talk about foreigners or immigrants or migrants or asylum seekers in what we would say polite society, right? So stuff that you don't need to apologize if somebody says it on air, right? The window of what was acceptable discourse about migrants and foreigners has shifted because people have systematically, I think, tried to push it. And each time you say a little bit more, of course I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. But then when you said it 3 times, it looks like I can say that. And then you move on to the next one. So over the time, 10 years, the window about foreigners and migrants was shifted until 45%, 55%, I don't really care. More than a third of UK people could follow a campaign which was, in many cases, explicitly and certainly implicitly racist. Now that's,
based on false facts as well.
All of that stuff.
And everything else. I kind of
Does that make me more pessimistic than you? I don't know.
I don't know. But look, is this a normal reaction to the PC kind of thing? Look, I've experienced high school in US in 1996 for 1 year. I was in South Carolina, close to Georgia, to Augusta, small community, and so on. And it was the beginning of politically correctness kind of thing. But as I'm looking at it now, it kind of grew into something totally different. I'm thinking about, for example, I do watch a lot of podcasts, Rogan and Peterson, or Peterson, I think.
Oh, Jordan Peterson,
Jordan
that
Peterson,
fella. I've
yeah,
heard of him, but
yeah.
I've never listened to him.
Okay, well, he's making a point how we are kind of taking some of the initial ideas of PC, which are totally fine, but we are kind of snowballing effect on it, which we bring more and more things there, which we are kind of not allowed to talk about or discuss, and so on. So then the shift in the public speech on migrants, let's say, isn't that, can you not put it like a counterbalance on the so many things that become, I don't know.
Well,
do we believe in
I
equilibrium in this
don't
world? Because if
know.
we no, okay.
So, well, yes, we do. So I think that's bullshit. But and I also, it's funny enough, I think it's kind of victim blaming as well. It's got this kind of funny resonance. But no, I don't think that's fair. So I don't think that one can account for an increasing intolerance of foreigners. One can say the reason for that is because for a number of years now, people have been trying to stop people referring to foreigners by bad words, right? I think that's a fallacious argument.
Okay, yeah. Strictly like that, I would agree. But like, my question was more like a feeling, maybe. I don't know. The less you cannot talk about, there will be people talking about it.
Yeah. No,
it's like trying to make a child unlearn a bad word.
Yeah.
Don't say that. He will say it. No?
Agreed. So there's a nice philosophical argument, which only my youngest daughter is the only one who gets around this one. I can tell you, don't think about an elephant. Don't think about an elephant. Don't think about an elephant. You'll think about an elephant. My youngest daughter, when I first told her that, she was like, "Okay, Daddy, I'm thinking about a chicken. I'm thinking about a chicken." I'm saying, "Don't think about an elephant." I'm not. I'm thinking about a chicken. I said, "Okay, you win." So no, I don't think that's right. I think that the rise of this kind of speech is driven quite systematically, and I mean, it's not that I'm paranoid, but that there is a bunch of very rich people who, billionaires, who are trying to generate false disputes in the world in order to distract from their own increase in power. And if you watch, I watched 2 films with Christian Bale on back to back on a flight. One's called The Big Short, and the other is called Vice. I seem to remember them both. And they gave this really interesting. They're both history films, right? I mean, and they give the history of I guess 80s, 90s, 2000s in America. And this was like a systematic campaign from some very rich people to get poor people to vote for tax cuts for the rich, right? It's just like, oh, how do you do it? And they tried a whole bunch of different ways until they found one that worked, and then then they did it. So no, I think that this stuff is cynically driven by people who stand to profit from an increase in division and hatred. And I think that the argument that it's as a result of people trying to get people to speak in a less offensive way is what we would call a canard. It's a red herring.
I stand corrected,
I
sir.
I don't think you do. We just disagree.
Okay. Yeah, let's... I told you I've asked my friends for a couple of questions. Yep. One of it is like, of course, happiness. So we talked about, the electro things which we can measure and or map in one way or another on the brain and so on. Does happiness look somehow?
Do you know, by the way, I can't help asking whether you know the joke from the Mrs. de Gaulle and Mrs. Churchill. Do you not know this joke?
No.
So de Gaulle and Churchill are at dinner, and Mrs. de Gaulle and Mrs. Churchill are there, and Mrs. Churchill's talking to Mrs. de Gaulle, and she says, and so what do you think, what is it that we're looking for in life? And Mrs. de Gaulle goes, a penis. and Mrs. Churchill says, excuse me? Sorry. She says, a penis. I think we all want a penis, don't we? I mean, a penis is definitely something which we can all agree on. So a penis with or without a French term, yes. So from a neuroscience perspective, this one I will do as a neuroscientist. Is that one going to make it in, Bogdan, or is that pushing the limits of your audience?
No, that was perfect. Yeah.
We didn't talk.
I have French guys that will not.
No, they won't find that funny at all.
They will not pronounce the H. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. There was nothing funny about that. What are you talking about? Anyway. So as a neuroscientist, I haven't a view on this. But my view, in fact, is one that's driven by the philosophy of Aristotle. So Aristotle wrote that there are two kinds of happiness. Okay, in Aristotle's view, there was in Greek eudaimonic happiness and there was hedonic happiness, and both. Well, eudaimonia doesn't really come through, but hedonic happiness, we know that in English. Hedonism is the pursuit of happiness. Now, from a neuroscience point of view, hedonic happiness is we know what that is, right? So I can measure how happy you are by measuring, to some extent, brain activity, but also just like looking at your face. I can look at your blood flow. I can look at so. And also to some extent, actually, you kind of know when you're happy, right? You're smiling. Smiling is a good way, certainly. Well, we'll come back to that. So it's something you can measure in the moment, and a lot of well-being psychology and well-being neuroscience relies on this hedonic happiness. So the 3 good things before bedtime stuff, if you think about, divide people in 3 groups of people, one of them goes to bed normally, one of them thinks about 3 things beginning with A from their day, and the other group thinks of 3 good things that happened in their day. The ones who think about 3 good things before bedtime are happier than people who think about 3 things beginning with A. Now, all of those things measure this thing which Aristotle described as hedonic happiness, which is happiness in the moment. And that's what we would call tractable. We can measure that. Aristotle believed there's another kind of happiness where the word doesn't really exist in English, eudaimonic happiness, eudaimonia. Now, eudaimonia is often best translated as something like right living. Okay? And here are some things that Aristotle thought about happiness in the eudaimonic sense. So first of all, he said you can't really tell till the end of the life. Okay, so he imagines a tyrant who can get anything he wants, right? And have anyone have anything, absolute power, but then on his deathbed realizes that he's wasted his life. And he's been happy all the time because But secondly, he says with eudaimonic happiness, and this is rather depressing in a way, isn't it? He says if you want to be happy, it's good to be wealthy and healthy and live in good times. So it's like, well, thanks. And it reminds me of this Israeli philosophical saying, it's better to be young, rich, happy, healthy, and well-friended than it is to be old, poor, miserable, sad, and alone, right? Exactly. So yes, I would agree with that. But Aristotle also believes for eudaimonic happiness that you can't think it through. Right? There's no reasoning that can... Yeah? He thinks that it's about good habits that you learn from people, ideally in early age. And he also thinks that, and this I think is quite interesting, he says that there are vicious extremes. So on any question, there's a kind of range, like, I don't know, how many times a week should you appear in a podcast? It's like, well, you can do it too infrequently, like everybody on the planet ought to be in a podcast, at least once every few weeks, isn't it? But equally, to be in 7 podcasts a week, would be too many. So there's somewhere. But the right point will depend on who you are, will vary from time to time, and will in many cases be quite close to the edge. So that's Aristotle's view of happiness. Now, whether neuroscience is going to be able to, firstly, to derive, you were asked at the beginning, can neuroscience address moral questions? I don't really see a neuroscientific argument that would give rise to that view of happiness. I think that's what we would say philosophical. And measuring whether that's right or not, again, also it feels to me, is also not a neuroscientific question. So I think, for me, neuroscience gives us part of a picture, but we need, friendship, morality, good luck, and to read enough good books in order to get the answers that we're interested in right.
Cool. Addiction, though. Can addiction be measured? Maybe happiness not, but addiction should be, right?
Yeah. So addiction. I did a podcast about this one actually, Bogdan. But
I saw it.
So addiction's super interesting. Here's the thing about addiction, which is interesting. If you do neuroscience, like I did, I mentioned to you that earlier on that a lot of the signaling in nerve cells is done by electrical activity. And that's the wires along, the axons, they're called, the long range connections between neurons use electrical signals. at the junctions between nerve cells, where the
synapse,
synapses, quite right, they use chemical signaling. And neuroreceptors are...
This is basically how you get high on weed, from what I understand. You smoke it, and then at the receptor level between the two, the axon and the neuron, right? That's
Between
the
the neurons.
little chemical thing that comes in. Boo.
Right. So that's roughly right. And the boo, certainly in my experience, works very well. Okay. So you have these neurotransmitters. These are small chemicals which you can think of like keys, and then you have locks, which are the receptors which are specifically tuned to that thing. Okay. Now the interesting point about when you study neuroscience is that there are different classes of receptor and neurotransmitter in the brain, and let me list out some of them for you. There are cannabinoid receptors.
Okay.
There are nicotinic receptors.
Okay.
And if you think about what the real-world chemicals that trigger them are. Now, cannabinoid receptors in the brain did not evolve to make us sensitive to cannabis, right?
They were right there.
Cannabinoid receptors evolved to be sensitive to neurotransmitters that were synthesized within the brain. It just so happens that they're called endogenous inside the brain. It so happens that there is this plant which has a shape and one of the chemicals in it that also triggers that. Similarly with nicotinic, we didn't evolve to be vulnerable to addiction from cigarettes. So the chemistry, the neurochemistry of addiction is in some ways coincidental. The substances that we can become addicted to happen to resemble things inside our brains. And I think that's probably why nicotine is one of the most addictive substances. Now, it is also the case that you can become, and again, those of you listening, I'm doing the air quotes, addicted to the internet or to certain kinds of behaviour. And that I think is partly metaphorical. So you've got patterns of behaviour which look a lot like being addicted to chemicals, but which are driven by behaviours rather than chemicals. And it's difficult. For example, if you go cold turkey on heroin or alcohol, there are some really, really specific physiological things that happen. You start sweating and you start shaking and all this kind of stuff. That doesn't happen if somebody takes away your iPhone. I mean, you're kind of grumpy and you really want it. Like you really, really want it. Remember, I'm the father of a 16-year-old daughter. But it's not quite the same as taking away alcohol from an alcoholic or heroin from an addict.
But still, it influences our behavior. And in the end of the day, I mean, I don't know what I want to say now. Well, you're judged by behavior. I mean, right? At the end of the day, that kind of classifies you in a way. Is our brain prone to classify?
Oh, sure. We're classifying machines, and that's why neural networks, which we can come to, are so effective and neurally inspired. But look, I mean, in the end, it's biology. Okay, and behavior or not, in the end, it's biology. But what I'm saying is that within biology, there are different kinds of things. There are addictive behaviors and others, and there are chemically addictive ones, and they're metaphorically. So we can understand it better through an understanding of chemical addiction, but it's not quite the same.
Okay. Let me rephrase it then somehow else. How can we not be influenced by, I think, what we see online? How can we detach in a way? How can you get that peace of mind with everything? I mean, everywhere you turn on a device, there might be something negative. You're gonna because I think it's human nature to kind of process it, which doesn't probably help you in the end of the day.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that, again, these arguments are fairly well rehearsed. If you haven't seen The Social Dilemma on Netflix, then you're right. But there are some pretty simple things that happened, we think, and to say they're simple doesn't make them any less dangerous. Arguably, we are all subject to the largest behavioural modification experiment that's ever been conducted. And why is that? Nobody, in fact, in my view, set out to do that. The way it happened was pretty simple. There were systems, we can call them algorithms, but it doesn't really matter. It was systems, automated systems, that were measured by how often people gave their attention to a program. Okay, so and the reason why they wanted attention, because they could sell more advertising the longer you were attending to the device. Now, the way these algorithms started to work was to try and predict your behavior. Because if they can predict what you're going to do, then they can serve you stuff that you're going to be interested in, and that will make you watch more, and they can sell more advertising. And that's kind of okay, right? I mean, it's not great, but it's kind of okay.
As long as I agree with it, yeah.
So
as
here's
long
the
as I
dangerous
can click yes or no.
Correct. Here's the dangerous bit. The model was predicated on the idea, I believe, that I'm not saying that we were fixed, but that it was a one-way system, right? That we were doing what we were doing, and the algorithm was trying to learn about us. But nobody told the algorithm that. In fact, you can't tell an algorithm anything because it's a fucking algorithm. So what the algorithm realized, and I don't mean realized because it doesn't realize anything, but the pattern it noticed was that if it could change your behavior to make you more predictable, then it can predict you better.
Wow.
Okay? Which, when you think about it, makes sense. And it's not even that the algorithm set out to change your behavior to make you predictable. It's just the algorithm tries a whole bunch of stuff. And one of the sets of stuff that it did had the unintended consequence, and I do think it's unintended, of modifying behavior to make it more predictable. And once it had reached that point, once it had noticed that that was working, why would it stop? Because when I make people more predictable, I can predict them better. And if I predict them better, I can sell them more advertising. Now, that's probably what happens. So the YouTube sidebar is a good example of that. And it's been well documented that if you start off looking around Islam, then it's like 4 clicks on the top recommendation on the YouTube sidebar, and you get to, terrorist grooming material, right? So it makes you more extreme because at the extremes, you're very predictable. Outrage is another good thing. If I can make you angry about something, then you're going to go, whoa, that's engagement. So all of these things are true. I don't think they were designed to be true, but they are. Now, listen, back to parenting a teenager, back to Aristotle. You have to develop good habits. If you ask yourself or your teenage daughter what they would like to do, hey, would you like to put your phone down for a bit? Ha! You're crazy. Cool. Or sure, a bit later, right? No one's ever going to say, yeah, sure. I definitely we're happy to stop that. The joke I always like is the one about the kid who's playing with himself in the back of the class, and the teacher says, "Now stop playing with yourself, Johnny, or you'll go blind." And the boy goes, "Well, Miss, can't I just carry on until I need glasses?" So we self-limiting is very hard, and so the only way to do it is to have. Sadly, parents, systems that restrict you through formal mechanisms. Give yourself screen time limits. When it stops, turn it off. Mostly the devices won't promote that, but that's the only way.
Do you think this is a risk growing up, or it can be a risk even if you're like a formed individual? Or
oh well, hey, you formed yet? I'm still working on myself.
I'm trying to.
Yeah, all right. Well, so look, it's certainly true. So 2 things to say about this. Firstly, it's certainly true that your brain is more malleable, can change more when you're younger than when you're older. There's no question about that. So to that extent, developing brains of children are more vulnerable to stuff than not. Now, there is a lot of stuff about screens being bad for children, and there's very little evidence of that. There's a lot of stuff. There's a ton of anti-youth stuff. People are so down on kids all the fucking time, and it makes me really grumpy. I've done, over the last 10, 15 years, lots and lots of work with young people, and they're amazing. I mean, they are the future, not just in the most literal sense. So I'm against all of this stuff. Young people, they can't concentrate. Young people, their brains have been rotten. Young people, they're all on social media. They don't get anything. Listen, it's just as... We're more vulnerable as old people to the distractions because we didn't grow up being able to handle them. Young people are doing brilliantly at school. They've never studied harder. They get incredible results. And they do that with their phones in their hands the whole time. That means they must be very, very good at focusing their attention on things, because if they were easily distracted like us old farts, then they wouldn't get anything done. They wouldn't get any exam results. So you can flip the arguments around. I don't think it's the case that kids' brains are being fried. But I do think it's the case, as as society does, that we need to put more barriers around the behavior of young people because their frontal lobes haven't been pruned. They make rubbish decisions, especially teenagers. And so you need rules. If you're listening, Ariella, you need rules in order to develop right. And you won't think that you want them because you think you know everything.
Yeah. So good and evil is something you develop through habits as you grow up, and it's the input, right? It's not the Aristotle's zoon politikon in which you already know, what is good and bad, and you just or
I don't know. I mean, I love talking about Aristotle, but my knowledge is still quite superficial. I don't think it's, again, as a neuroscientist, I don't think concepts of good and evil have a biological
have a biology.
definition. I think we recognize bad behavior, and that recognition of bad behavior is a biological thing. But what we understand to be bad, I mean, this is perhaps the last thing I would say in terms of neuroscience. So look, we are biological systems, but we evolved in culture. And to try and understand the brain without understanding culture would be to try and understand. So we have systems in our body that control movement, okay? But if you don't know about friction or gravity, it's pretty much impossible to understand the movement control systems. Why would you have a thing which, goes there? Why would you push a bottle but then know that it's going to slip? Unless you understand gravity and friction, you can't understand the bits of the brain that control movement, because the bits of the brain that control movement are modeling gravity and friction in order to allow you to manipulate the world, okay?
Makes total sense.
When we talk about moral stuff, when we talk about recognition of behavior, when we talk about how we interact, our brain systems evolved as individuals. I'm talking now not evolution of the species. Our brain systems, we should say, developed to model culture, right? Our upbringing made us. We made each other as we grew up. Therefore, to understand who we are without reference to culture is impossible. So we need, as neuroscientists, and this was, I think, one of your early questions, the limits of neuroscience. In order to understand the brain, we cannot restrict ourselves to a solely biological account. We need to work. I'm so delighted to be doing this in Best Bookshop in Prague, Globe Books. We need to have the novel as a way of understanding subjective consciousness. We need culture and an understanding and an analysis of culture, which the humanities gives us, in order to understand ourselves. Now, neuroscience has to be part of the story, but it can't be the exclusive part.
Do you have any questions then?
I have a question which is maybe not connected to anything we spoke
Please.
until now.
Cool.
About time we moved it on.
And I
Yes.
plan to ask this question to all of our guests because I think it's a topic which came to the light in recent years again, extraterrestrials.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's a two question in one. It depends how you answer the first one. So do you believe that there is a extraterrestrial life out there somewhere? And if yes, do you believe it exists in such a form that that life already came to Earth in some form to either observe or to see what we are doing here on Earth? And maybe the third question is if you believe that it exists in a form that it's actually looking after us to not do something evil to the planet, because they already know that we are doing something bad. So
Yes.
3 questions.
Yeah. Yes, no, and therefore no. Right. But no, so it seems to me unlikely, but possible, that there is no other life form anywhere else in the universe. Depends a little bit on your definition of life. I doubt there's a Dan Glaser sitting doing a podcast in a parallel universe. I would be quite surprised if they're already here. It's difficult, isn't it? Certainly if they're anything like us, they wouldn't be able to resist just occasionally, just a little prod. If this is what it's like when they're looking after us, I hate to think what it would be like if they weren't.
Because in the recent years there came out some confessions of people which work, for example, in nuclear facilities, which confessed, and I cannot say if it's true or not, that at some point where there was some conflict which could end up in some nuclear war, let's say, conveniently either the machines or the whole power plant stopped working for some time, where there was the conflict, where there was the decision, okay, push the button or not.
Yes.
So that's why I'm asking if you think that some life form out there thinks that we are not doing good things to the planet and therefore trying to actually influence our decisions in what we are going to do in the future.
Okay, so Bogdan before asked whether I thought we could blame Russian interference for Brexit and Trump, and I said that I was more pessimistic, that we need to blame our fellow countrymen, if we're English or American, British or American for that. In answering your question, I think I take a more positive view, which is to say, no, I don't think it's aliens. I think it's humans that have kept us going. I think there is within all of us a spark of good. When, I think that the avoidance of catastrophe so far must in part have been due to a few good, I would say men, but probably actually women in reality.
Okay. Shall we take a break or shall we end?
You ask your question and I think.
I'm pretty much, I'm pretty much done, I think, Bogdan. So,
okay. So no more. I mean,
You have one question which was.
right.
I knew Stan had something else.
Yeah. So we're gonna cut this because.
No, it's fine. People are allowed to forget the one thing they're supposed to remember. That's fine.
Supposed to remember.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I always close by asking my my invitees is if you could change anything about the world today, like finger snap and it would be done. What would you do?
Having spent the last 3 months enjoying, to my mind, the most beautiful city in the world, which is Prague, where we are sitting, without hordes of tourists. Since you ask, I'm going to say one thing, but it's a hybrid thing. I would like to be in Prague still without the millions and millions of tourists, but it would be really great if at some point before we leave, and it's not going to happen because we're off next week, they could just open some stuff. Right?
Right.
I've seen the outsides of all of the most beautiful buildings, some fantastic looking restaurants, some incredible cafes, some museums, the Philharmonic, the National Gallery, the ballet, the thing. Just, it would be wonderful if at some point it would be possible to just go inside somewhere and do something there. So that, if I may, Bogdan, if I can snap my fingers for one thing, just open some stuff up.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Daniel, for sitting with us.
It's been a huge pleasure. I came in to buy a book last week, and this has been one of the most delightful, unexpected consequences. I've enjoyed this.
Thank you so much for having the time, for doing this, and for, I guess, we're obnoxious to a PhD level. I mean, but thank you for explaining it so we can understand, and the viewers probably will take a lot of, good stuff out of it. You want to mention, because you mentioned your podcast, right? So maybe you want to mention where
I'd be
people...
happy to. Yeah. So, obviously go see White Bird when it comes out, which will be the Christmas movie, I guess, from Lionsgate. If you want to check out A Neuroscientist Explains on The Guardian, podcast available where all good podcasts are. I'm sure this will be too. No, thank you very much for having me. It's been one of the longest periods without a mask, thanks to the distancing and the ventilation. Masks back on, chaps. Nice to see you. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you as well for being here. And as always, Gillian Anderson, if you're listening, drop us an email to 19to the dozen@protonemail.com because we want to invite as well. Ciao. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having me. Cheers.